When a young girl stepped into the shelter, no one could have predicted what was about to happen. In the quietest corner, a German shepherd, known for his silence, suddenly broke down. His eyes welled with tears, and a soft, mournful whimper escaped as soon as he saw her. The entire shelter seemed to freeze in place. Families paused mid-step, staff members exchanged bewildered looks, and even the constant barking of other dogs seemed to fade into silence. Why had this dog remained so quiet for so long, only to cry like a child at the sight of this girl? What bond could possibly exist between a lonely shelter dog and a small child? The answer would leave everyone speechless. That afternoon, the shelter was alive with noise. Barks echoed against concrete walls like a desperate chorus. Metal doors clattered as workers passed through, while the scraping of restless paws against iron bars filled the air. Families strolled from cage to cage, crouching to meet hopeful eyes and wagging tails before moving on to the next kennel. To most, it was simply a building full of dogs longing for a chance at a home. But tucked away in the farthest corner was a dog who seemed to have already abandoned the thought of being chosen. His name was Shadow. The staff called him the Invisible Dog. No matter how many visitors came, Shadow never raised his head or wagged his tail to greet them. While the others barked frantically or stretched their paws through the bars, desperate to be noticed, Shadow stayed motionless. He didn't beg, didn't compete, and made no sound. His stillness was more haunting than noise. It was as if he had already surrendered. Each morning, when the shelter lights flickered on, Shadow would open his eyes to another day of waiting. And every evening, as the barking faded and the doors locked shut, he would rest his head back down, untouched by the world around him. To a casual visitor, it might have looked like indifference. But the workers saw something else. There was longing in his gaze, a quiet sorrow that could not be ignored. It wasn't that he didn't want to be chosen. It was that he was waiting for someone specific, someone he remembered. He had no way of knowing if that person would ever return. Still, day after day, he lingered at the edge of his kennel, staring toward the doors in silence. Though he never moved or barked, anyone who looked closely could see the truth. Shadow hadn't given up completely. He was holding on for one chance, for one person. That same afternoon, the shelter door swung open and a family stepped inside. A young couple guided their little girl between them. Her name was Emily. She was no older than 7, her wide, thoughtful eyes giving her an air of maturity beyond her years. She wore a pale blue dress that swayed gently as she walked, her hair neatly tied back with a ribbon. With one hand, she clung to her mother's fingers. With the other, she nervously tugged at the hem of her dress. From the moment she entered, her gaze swept the rows of kennels as though she were searching for something only she could see. Around her, the shelter was filled with noise, dogs barking, tails thumping against cages, families laughing as energetic puppies leapt up in excitement. But Emily didn't laugh. She seemed not to hear the chaos at all. Her father crouched down beside her, trying to catch her attention. "Do you see one you like, sweetheart?" he asked gently. But Emily didn't answer. She let go of her mother's hand, as if an unseen force were pulling her deeper into the shelter. Her small shoes tapped against the concrete floor with steady determination. Then, halfway down the aisle, Emily suddenly froze. Her little body went rigid, as though time itself had stopped. Her eyes widened, her breath caught in her chest, and her trembling fingers clutched tightly at the hem of her dress. The shelter's noise seemed to fade away, leaving only the pounding of her heart and the cage at the far end of the row. Her lips parted, and in a breath so faint it was almost inaudible, she spoke a single word, meant only for herself. She had found him. Inside that distant cage, Shadow slowly raised his head. For weeks, no, for months, he had hardly moved, hardly cared. Yet, in that moment, something deep within him awakened, as though her voice had reached a place no one else could ever touch. His ears flicked, his body quivered. Then, to the astonishment of everyone nearby, his dark eyes began to shine. A fragile whimper slipped from his throat, quiet at first, then growing louder, carrying down the row until the chatter of visitors melted into silence. It was the raw sound of a heart breaking open. Emily pressed a trembling hand to the cold steel bars, tears filling her eyes. She didn't speak at first. She didn't need to. Her expression carried it all, recognition, longing, and love colliding at once. Shadow shuffled closer, pressing his paws frantically against the iron, reaching for her as if he couldn't endure the distance. His cry rose, unguarded and aching, filling the shelter with grief and hope so powerful no one could ignore it. Visitors froze where they stood, conversations cut short. Parents drew their children near, staring in disbelief. Staff members exchanged confused glances. The dog who never barked, never wagged his tail, never tried to be noticed, was suddenly bursting with life, pouring out years of silence in one desperate plea. Emily, tears streaking down her cheeks, finally found her voice. "It's him," she gasped. Her voice cracked as she repeated, louder this time so her parents could hear. "It's him. This is Shadow." Her parents froze. They shared a startled glance, their faces caught between disbelief and fear of giving in to hope. Could this silent, broken German shepherd truly be the dog their family had lost? Shadow pressed closer to the bars, his cries softening into low, pleading whines, his gaze locked on Emily. He ignored the strangers, the footsteps, the voices around him. Nothing mattered but the little girl standing in front of him. A staff member approached carefully, clipboard in hand, speaking in a voice edged with apology. He was found wandering the streets months ago. No collar, no microchip. We've never known who he belonged to. He's been like this ever since, quiet, withdrawn. He doesn't respond to anyone, but even as she spoke, Shadow proved her wrong. His tail began to thump against the floor. His paws scraped the bars as he strained to get closer to Emily. Emily's mother knelt beside her, gently wiping away her tears. "Sweetheart, are you sure?" she asked softly. Emily nodded firmly, her small frame shaking with certainty. "He remembers me. I know it's him around them." The shelter seemed to hold its breath. Visitors stood frozen. Staff exchanged bewildered looks. Something extraordinary was unfolding, something far beyond chance. Emily's lips quivered as she brushed away her tears. For a moment, she stood still, her tiny fingers gripping the bars tightly. Then, in a trembling voice, she spoke the name she had whispered in her heart every night since he vanished. "Shadow, come here, boy." The effect was immediate, undeniable. Shadow's ears shot up, his body stiffened, his eyes wide with recognition. For one breathless second, he stood frozen, making sure he had truly heard her. Then, like a dam bursting, it all came pouring out. He barked sharply, not in fear, but in pure joy. His tail pounded the floor uncontrollably. His paws clawed desperately at the bars, straining to reach the girl he had never forgotten. His cries tumbled into a frantic mix of whimpers and yelps. Gasps spread through the crowd. Even the staff who had cared for Shadow every single day stood frozen in disbelief. They had never once heard him bark, nor seen his tail thrash with such wild, unrestrained joy. Emily reached through the narrow space between the bars, stretching her hand as far as it would go. Shadow pressed his nose firmly into her palm, showering her fingers with desperate licks, as if trying to erase every painful second they had been apart. Tears streamed freely down Emily's cheeks as she cried out, her voice breaking with certainty. "I told you it's him. He never forgot me." One of the workers fumbled with the keys, her hands trembling so hard she struggled to fit the right one into the lock. The entire aisle had gone silent. Families who had been walking moments earlier now stood still, holding their breath. Shadow pawed anxiously at the bars, his tail beating the floor in a frantic rhythm, every inch of him aching to be free. At last, the lock gave way with a click. The door swung open. In an instant, Shadow surged forward, not timidly, not cautiously, but with a flood of pure, unstoppable love. He charged straight into Emily's arms, knocking her gently back onto her knees. She let out a startled cry, but her voice carried only joy. Shadow buried his face into her chest, his whole body trembling with relief. He covered her face with frantic kisses, each one carrying the weight of the long months they had lost. Emily wrapped her small arms tightly around his neck, pressing her face into his fur, holding him as if she would never let go again. No one watching needed an explanation anymore. Not the other families, not the staff, not even Emily's parents, who only moments before had doubted their daughter's certainty. The truth was undeniable. Shadow wasn't just another shelter dog. He was family. "Get the paperwork," one staff member whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Another hurried off toward the front desk, scrambling to complete the forms as quickly as possible. Emily stayed on the floor, clinging to Shadow, her tears falling freely, but her smile shining brighter than ever. "You're home now," she whispered into his fur, her voice quivering with happiness. "You're finally home." Shadow melted into her embrace, his eyes half closed in pure contentment. Every so often, he let out a soft whimper, the sound of months of silence finally breaking into relief. When the last signature was written, the shelter staff gathered around, their faces glowing with smiles they couldn't hide. To them, this wasn't just an adoption. It was something far more powerful. "It's a miracle," one whispered, and every single person silently agreed. Emily proudly held the leash in her small hand, her other hand never leaving Shadow's thick fur. He trotted beside her with new energy, tail wagging nonstop, as if the world had suddenly filled with light again. Together, they walked toward the shelter doors. Shadow turned his head once, his eyes glistening with gratitude, before stepping forward with the family he had never stopped waiting for.